Hello everyone, welcome back to our series on learning how to go birding. This is part 2 of 3, and if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I would really strongly recommend going back and doing so before doing this part, because part 1 really does lay the foundation for learning how to ID a bird, what to look for, and that sort of thing. So this part might be a little confusing if you haven't watched part 1. So in this part 2, we're going to go over some tricky bird groups, and then at the end go through an exercise on the process you're going to go through when you figure out a bird identification. So the last video ended with a comparison of a few silhouettes of typical bird families, some of which you probably could identify, like owls and ducks, but a lot of them did probably look the same. And there are a lot of bird families. So like I was just saying, you probably know some of them. Everyone knows what a duck looks like, what an owl looks like. Birds like gulls and hummingbirds and hawks are going to be pretty distinctive. And there are a lot of bird groups that even if you don't know them right now, their distinctiveness means that you're probably going to pick them up pretty quickly. So things like herons or shorebirds or woodpeckers all have some pretty distinctive characteristics that are fairly easy to learn if you spend some time with your bird book. So if you take away those really distinctive groups, you're left mostly with the passerine birds. Passerine is just the scientific name for a songbird. And this is probably the hardest group to learn. But even within this group, though, there are going to be ones that you know, like crows and jays on the right there. They're quite big, they're fairly loud, they're quite gregarious. At the bottom, you see blackbirds. They're also going to be a little bit louder, a little bit bigger. So those groups you can learn after a little while. And then swallows at the top, they have really distinctive forked tails and a really distinctive flight pattern. And chickadees on the far left, they have a very unique plump, squat sort of silhouette and stature. So now we're left with 6 groups of songbirds that to a beginner and even to an intermediate are often going to seem to all muddle together and look very much the same. And these are some birds that even expert birders might have to take an extra second on. So we're going to go through them here, give you a bit of a head start, and go through a few key characteristics of each group so you can tell them apart a little easier or a little faster. So the first group is the flycatchers and similar species. So flycatchers are generally going to be small and slender. They're going to have fairly muted, fairly drab colors. That western kingbird on the bottom is going to be about as flashy as you're going to get. Most of these are going to have quite long wings and long tails proportionate to their bodies. And they're just going to use those to move really easily and really in a really agile fashion through the air because they catch insects on the wing. They're flycatchers. If you look at their bills are quite wide and flat. This also helps them catch birds in the air, and they generally have fairly short, quite thin legs because they really only use them for perching. Flycatchers are often seen out on very conspicuous perches. So if there's one dead branch coming off of a tree, there'll be a flycatcher perched right at the tip, and this gives them a really good vantage point to look for flying insects so they can dart out, catch it, and then go back to their perch. Flycatchers generally tend to be solitary. That being said, waxwings on the right, they're very gregarious. They're rarely seen without a handful of other similar birds. A lot of species are going to be quiet, but some might be vocal. Their songs aren't really going to classify them as a group. And they're often going to be higher up in trees because they want to get higher so they can look out for those insects. So thrushes and similar birds, they're often going to be a little bigger than some songbirds. Think of a robin. It's a little bit bigger than some of those tiny other birds you might see in your garden. Thrushes are going to be generally kind of a brownish gray, not super colorful birds. You can see the varied thrush there. It does have some orangey yellow in the middle there, but it is kind of drab and charcoaly on its back. Thrushes generally tend to prefer the understory, so the shrubs and bushes at the base of a tree. And they're going to be spending a lot of time on the ground foraging. Again, think of a robin. They're going to have really strong, thick legs. And they also have very, very large eyes. If you look at the robin, if you look at the Swainson's thrush on the left, you can see they have very proportionately large eyes to the size of their body. They're also going to be fairly quiet. Robins are a bit of an outlier there, except when they're singing their songs in the breeding time. You'll very rarely hear them that much. Wrens are probably one of the more recognizable groups in this little tricky group of birds here, because they're all going to have a fairly similar stature and way of holding themselves. So they're very small, very compact, and they have very long tails that you can see in the Pacific Wren, the furthest left and furthest right photo. They hold up in a very distinctive upright position. Wrens are often very, very active. They're very, very vocal. They rarely stop moving for long unless they're singing, and their songs are often very rapid, very complicated, very loud, and they tend to be a little bit longer. Wrens can get tricky because their plumage is mostly just brown. There's some white and gray sometimes mixed in, like you can see on that Buick's Wren on the right. And almost all wrens are going to have really, really fine barring. So those teeny tiny little bars of lighter browns and grayish colors that you can see on a lot of their wings and tails, that's quite distinctive to this group. They prefer quite a lot of different habitats, but generally within the habitat, whether it's a forest or a grassland, they prefer brush piles and really dense understories and shrubs. So here's the first exercise. Of the first 3 bird groups that we just went through, which do you think this is? So for these exercises, I'm not going to wait too long. I will just pause for a couple seconds. So I would recommend through this presentation, if you do want to work through them, to have your hand on that pause button just so you can pause it and give it a bit of thought first. So this bird is part of the Wren group. You can notice the upturned tail, the fact that it's fairly small and it's mostly brownish. For bonus points, you can take a look through your bird book, see if you can figure out what kind of wren this is. So I'll move on here in just a sec. So this is a marsh wren. In this instance, you don't really have to look at very many markings or know its behavior or hear its song to classify this. It's a wren, and it's standing on top of a cattail in a marshy pond, which is the exact habitat that marsh wrens like. They're very well named. If you look in your bird book, you'll see a lot of wrens are going to be in habitats other than this one, so it really helps you narrow it down very fast. So moving on to warblers and vireos. These particular birds aren't that closely related, but they do have a lot of similar characteristics. So these groups are known for their very beautiful plumages. They're going to be very, very bright colors, especially a lot of yellow. You can see that yellow warbler in the top middle there. The yellow rumped warbler on the far left has a really, really bright yellow throat. They're very, very different among the sexes. So males are going to be those very bright colors. Females are going to be quite drab. Vireos aren't quite as colorful, but they tend to have a little bit of a greenish hint to them. Both warblers and vireos are very, very active. They're very good flyers. They rarely stop moving. So they forage by gleaning insects off of twigs and leaves, and so their bills are very, very well suited to this. You can see, especially on the yellow warbler, this teeny, tiny pointy beak they use to just stick in the cracks of leaves and twigs just to get those bugs. There are a ton of different warblers. They're one of the most speciose, or there's more species of them than a lot of other birds. You can actually buy books just on warblers. So they can be a little bit difficult, but they are a very, very beautiful group of birds with very beautiful songs generally as well. So which of these birds do you think is the warbler? So it's this one, the top left. So you can look at that really fairly small pointy beak. It's quite small as well, just in its general stature. It's kind of in the middle of a shrub, as opposed to that flycatcher on the right, which is right at the end of a twig. The thrush on the bottom is a lot larger, and you can see that really, really large eye and really big, strong legs for gleaning on the ground. So the warbler doesn't have those particular characteristics. It's small, the tiny beak, lots of yellow, and very beautiful bird. So sparrows are probably one of the most complicated families to differentiate. They generally have a very dull plumage, mostly brown, white, and gray, very nondescript, very rarely a whole lot of distinctive markings on the surface. And when you get into detail, when you look at them individually, you can see that their markings are actually very complex. Sparrows can be a bit difficult because they're generalists, so they'll eat seeds, they'll eat insects, they kind of do lots of different things. So their bills in particular are kind of in the middle. They're not too big, not too small, not too long, not too pointy. A lot of them, though, are going to forage on the ground. That is where they prefer to forage, in the ground in really, really low understory. So they're going to have really pretty thick, strong legs for that as well. They're very diverse, and they have occupy lots of different habitats, very diverse songs. So this is a group that might take a little longer to really feel comfortable with. So here we are, which is the sparrow. Give a couple seconds here. So the sparrow is the top right. So you can see it's not a wren. The wren on the bottom has that really distinctive upturned tail, although wrens don't do that all the time. A vireo, you can see the beak is very small, very pointy. It's kind of like a greenish gray or greenish yellow drab color. It doesn't have that striping and marking that the sparrow does. The vireo has fairly thin, tiny legs. The sparrow has really thick, strong legs. So just a bunch of very small things that kind of let you know what kind of bird this is. So the last group is the finches and cardinals. We don't have specifically cardinals in British Columbia, but they are a part of the group. A lot of these species are relatively small, but some of them are bigger, like grosbeaks, you can see on the right there. They're again going to be usually quite sexually dimorphic. Again, kind of like the warblers, the males are going to be those really bright, dramatic colors, and the females are going to be a lot less bright, a lot of browns and grays and stuff. So finches, their main characteristic is a very thick, triangular shaped beak. They're seed eaters. So that beak is for crunching down on nuts and seeds so they can get into the middle there. They're a bit of a more plump, stocky bird. Their tails aren't that long. In the winter specifically, they tend to group up in lots of different groups with a lot of different birds, and they do actually quite love feeders. So if you have a feeder, you'll probably get to know your finches. But the finches do have that big beak. That's the main feature you can look for on a finch. So those are the 6 bird groups. If you aren't feeling completely confident with them, it's totally fine to go back and listen to them again. They are tricky for a reason. But if you're feeling a little confident, want to see how you're doing, let's see if we can name each of the groups that these birds are from. So some of the things to look for, remember, are look at the bill, look at their color, overall size, their habitat, maybe some patterning. Those are all things to remember when you're trying to figure out which group a bird is from. So the first one, the bird on the upper left-hand corner, that one is a finch. So this is actually an American goldfinch in its winter plumage, if you want to look it up in your bird book. So one of the key characteristics here is that bill. It's going to be very, very triangular, very strong looking. The base of it's going to be very wide for the size of its head. The second one is going to be part of the flycatcher group. So this is actually a western wood pewee, which is part of the flycatcher group. So remember to look at that bill. It's a really flat, wide bill, perfect for snatching insects out of the air. You can also see that the flycatcher is perching on a stick that doesn't seem to have anything else around it, so it has a really good vantage point to catch those insects. And it also isn't very colorful. It's kind of drab, kind of a grayish, pale white color. The third bird is part of the Wren group. So its tail is not going to be held upright in this photo, but that's not something they do all the time. So you can't lean on that as a single identification characteristic. So for the wrens, you can notice again how small they are. They're sort of all over brownish color, and that really fine barring that they have on their wings and tail, those fine details can help you identify wrens as well. The bird on the bottom left is going to be part of the thrush family. So again, thrushes, they generally tend to be in sort of the middle of bushes and trees. You can see that thrush is surrounded by a bunch of juniper branches there. Thrushes are usually relatively not colorful. That one's, quite gray. And they have very strong legs for perching and hopping on the ground, and very large eyes compared to the size of their head. So that one is actually a Townsend's solitaire. This middle bottom bird here is a warbler, a yellow warbler to be exact. So they're very tiny. Again, they're going to be in the middle of a tree or a shrub. Remember, they glean insects from bark and from leaves. That teeny tiny pointy beak is perfect for just plucking insects off of things. And he's really bright colored and a lot of yellow. That is very typical of the warblers. So the last bird is part of the sparrow family. So remember, sparrows are going to be all over very unassuming colors. Lots of browns, lots of grays, lots of creamy whites. The beak isn't particularly special in any way. Like I said when I was describing it at first, not too big, not too small, not too long, not too short. Their legs are quite strong and thick for hopping on the ground. And their patterns, while they look kind of not too significant, they do always have some sort of patterning on their back or on their breast in different shades of brown or gray or sometimes black, like this small sparrow here. So now that we've gone through the 6 overall classifications, let's see if we can do a full bird exercise. So the scenario here is that you're out on a hike, you've been hiking, maybe for an hour or so, and you see this pair of birds here. So just a hint, they are the same species. It is a mated pair. So the first thing you need to decide is what group are they a part of? So for each step here, like I've been doing before, I'm only going to pause for a second or two. So just be ready to pause the video at each step if you want to work through it a little slower yourself. So based on some of the characteristics here, what kind of bird do you think it is? Remember how helpful the beaks often can be. And so if you look at the beak here, you can decide that it is a finch. Those are very triangular, very strong looking beaks, perfect for cracking some seeds and some nuts open. So finches are going to be located at the back of your bird book, the very back, usually the last section. Once you get there, you'll probably notice there are a lot of finches, but depending on what kind of book you have, don't forget to check your range maps. So the book that I have here has a good handful of them that can be found in the Okanagan. A lot of them have lots of yellow or lots of red. The male here at the top has no yellow on him, so that means it's not a goldfinch. And he only has a little bit of red at the top of its head. So in my book, that sort of leads me to either a house finch, a common redpoll, or a Cassin's finch. And so generally when people start birding, male birds tend to be a lot easier to identify because they are often the ones with distinctive markings. Females can be a little bit harder sometimes, but it's important not to forget about them when you're trying to make an ID, or an identification, I should say. So if we look at the female in this scenario, you'll notice that she is all brown on the top of her head. So that means, if you look at the 3 birds that we're considering, it's not a common redpoll, because female common redpolls do have a little patch of red on the top of their head. So now it's either a house finch or a Cassin's finch, and they look very, very similar. But remember where we are. We're out in the forest. We've been hiking for a while, not particularly close to civilization. So looking in our bird book, what does that tell us? It tells us that we're looking at a Cassin's finch. So your bird book should mention somewhere that house finches are more often than not found in cities and towns and at feeders and pretty close to civilization, whereas Cassin's finches live in open coniferous forests. And there you are. That's all there is to it, bird identification in a nutshell. So this is the end of part 2 now. Part 3 will go into the equipment and resources you'll need to help you successfully go birding. And it's also going to go into making your yard bird friendly, attracting birds, putting up nest boxes and feeding birds and so on. So thanks for listening, and I hope to see you in part 3.